You've had a taste of A Raisin in the Sun now, and if you remember from our intro to the unit, the title of the play actually comes from a poem by Langston Hughes. So we're going to take a little detour away from the play and practice analyzing poems that really feed into the themes proposed in A Raisin in the Sun. So our learning target for 1.4 is that you'll be able to analyze 3 poems with attention to literary devices such as symbolism and simile. You'll be able to understand the meaning of the poems and take it a bit farther and connect it specifically to A Raisin in the Sun. So keep watching this video and I'll give you all the background you need to know. Poetry rules. It's awesome. You may or may not agree with me on that. And it also has some unique rules to it. Remember from when we were looking at The Hill We Climb back in Unit 0? Poetry is written in lines, not in sentences. So instead of the words going all the way to the end of the page and then going back to the next line and then the next line, poets get to choose where to end a line, and they sometimes break it up in the middle of a sentence. That means pay attention to those line breaks. Why do you think the poet chose to break it there? Usually what's at the very beginning or very end of a line is especially important. Overall, poetry uses language creatively to get a deeper meaning across. Yes, you could simply say, I think racism is bad. And of course, many people are doing that. But these poets are trying to use language in an emotional, evocative way that's going to connect with people more than just straightforward speech. So remember as you're looking through the poem to focus not just on the literal, that is, what is straightforward, factual, what is actually true, but to focus on the figurative, language that is suggestive, imaginative. It might not be 100% true, but it lets us imagine something bigger. 2 particular types of figurative language that we're going to focus on in these poems are symbolism and simile. Symbolism is when one thing is representing a bigger idea. So, for example, take the dove. It's just a bird, but in many societies, it comes to represent a symbol of peace. If, on the other hand, I show you a raven, it's also just a bird, but it tends to have some darker representations, especially with a skull, a classic symbol of death and often evil. Simile is when you compare 2 unlike things using like or as. So if you've ever watched a romance movie where the main characters finally kiss and one of them says, that was like fireworks, well, they don't mean that their mouth was literally exploding with bright colors. That would probably be a little painful. They're making a comparison to get across that sense of excitement and climax. If I say she rushed through the school like a tornado, well, probably the school is not getting torn apart, but I'm using that comparison to give a sense of her urgency, her out of controlness, any of that. That's how simile works. So our first poem you'll be looking at is titled We Wear the Mask by Paul Laurence Dunbar. He wrote this poem in 1896, and he was the son of freed slaves. So while he didn't experience slavery himself, he had a lot of personal connection to that and knew his parents' history very well. As you read this poem, there's a few things to keep in mind. Firstly, it says we wear the mask, so who is the we in this poem? Who is it who has to wear the mask? What does that mask symbolize anyway? Think about the difference between Paul Laurence Dunbar and a guy wearing a very happy mask. I know that's a really silly picture. But what could a mask mean? And finally, why does the speaker wear the mask? Does he want to? Does he have to? What's going on with that? Pay close attention to the symbolism in this poem. Our second poem is also by Paul Laurence Dunbar, and it is called Sympathy. It was written a few years later in 1899, and the final line of the poem was actually borrowed 60 years later almost 70 years later, really, by Maya Angelou, one of the most famous contemporary African American poets. So his ideas in this poem have had a lasting impact. As you read this poem, keep symbolism in mind again. Think about what a caged bird could represent. Pay attention, too, to how the caged bird's actions change from the first stanza to the last stanza, just like Gorman's symbol of a new day changed throughout her poem. And finally, pay attention to the repetition in the poem. How does that affect it? How does that affect the tone? How does it shape the way you respond to it? Our final poem is the one that Raisin in the Sun gets its name from. This is Harlem by Langston Hughes. This was written in 1951, so less than a decade before A Raisin in the Sun was written. These two texts come out of the same time period. And it grew out of the movement known as the Harlem Renaissance. A renaissance means a rebirth and is usually used to mean a cultural rebirth when there's an influx in art and science and ideas. And the Harlem Renaissance was specifically an influx in African American artists and intellectuals revitalizing Black culture and really staking their claim on what Black music could be, what Black poetry could be, what Black art could be. So when Langston Hughes names this poem Harlem, he never actually mentions Harlem in the poem, but think about what it might mean to connect this poem to the idea of Harlem and the Harlem Renaissance. He uses a ton of similes in this poem. The whole poem is similes. So think about what kind of tone comes from the similes. Are they positive or negative comparisons? And finally, since we know that Lorraine Hansberry knew this poem, she used its title, think about what this poem can tell us about Raisin. So as you go through each poem, you'll be taking some short notes on them. Start by writing down the title, and then you want to paraphrase. So in your own words, what do you think is the overall meaning of the poem in just a sentence or so? Connotation means kind of the associations, the feelings you get about it. So does it have a positive or negative connotation to it? Shifts means anything that changes in the poem. So like I said, does that caged bird do the same thing in the first stanza and the last stanza? Look for moments of change. Those tend to be important. You'll also write down the opening and ending lines. These tend to be the parts that are most memorable. The poet chose them for a reason. You'll put the title again. I know it seems a little silly, but now that you've really thought through some of the poem's meaning, thinking back to the title can let you dig even deeper. And finally, you'll want to put a theme of the poem. What do you think is the message that the poet is trying to get across? So if Amanda Gorman's theme was change in America can come, but only if we work together to bring it, what are these poets saying about America, about their lives, about Black culture in the 19th and 20th centuries? And what can we take from that to A Raisin in the Sun? So have fun looking at these poems, really dig into them. They're short, but there's a lot going on there.